Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. On the 7th anniversary, we re-examined the war on Iraq through the eyes of authors. Some authors focused on the military campaign. Others paid attention to the human tragedy. But very few kept their eyes fixed on the whole picture. Today, bookshelves are brimming with books on the war. But does that mean we know the whole story? Or will history reveal some shocking secrets? While authors strive to provide readers with insight, history has its own way of forming perspectives. Critics of the war have asked, when authors write the story of Iraq, do they tell an American, German, Russian, or an Iraqi story? To get to the truth, one of our guests had to live his thrilling experience with fighters of the Iraqi resistance. I am delighted to welcome from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Professor Juan Cole, whose website, juancole.com, over the last 7 years has emerged as one of the best sources for news and analyses about Iraq. And from Munich, Germany, Jürgen Todenhofer, author of Why Do You Kill Zaid?, a book which in 2008 was leading the German bestseller list for many months. The book has been translated into Arabic and English. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Jürgen Todenhofer, explain the enigmatic title of your book, Why Do You Kill Zaid? Who is Zaid, and why are you asking him, why do you kill?
The reason why I ask this question and why I make these trips to Iraq and sometimes also to Afghanistan is that the Western people, the people from the United States and from my country, don't understand the Muslim world. They don't understand why these people are fighting, why they want to be free. And I didn't want to give the answer. I want to ask a young student who lives in Ramadi, and he was fighting against Americans, and he has destroyed a tank. And I wanted to ask him, why did you kill? And I spent a week with him in Ramadi, and he told me his story. And it's just a story of a young student, a student like all the students all over the world. He wanted to study, and then he didn't want to fight, and then his brother was killed. And then he decided together with his youngest brother to continue to study and not to fight. And then the Americans killed his second brother. And he saw his second brother dying in front of their house. He couldn't go outside because there was heavy shooting. He saw through the window how his little brother died. And this night he decided to fight. And he became a fighter. He became a fighter not to revenge, but to free his country. And that's the story. And that's what I asked him, why do you kill Zaid? And he gave me the answer, and it was a very sad answer.
That is one chapter, Juan Cole, and there are many stories like that as related by Todenhofer. I'm sure you know many, many other stories, and you have covered the war. And like we said in our intro, your website has emerged over the past 7 years as perhaps one of the best, if not the best, for news and analysis about Iraq. And yet, having said that, do we know the whole story about Iraq today, or will be surprised in the future that some secrets are still lingering?
Well, you know, there was a great diplomatic historian who said there are no secrets if you know where to look. I don't think that we have great secrets in store for us. The general outlines of what we know are that the Bush administration, for its own reasons, launched this war on false pretexts. It lied repeatedly over 900 times to the American people about why it was doing it. And having conquered the country, they made no provision for post-war governance. They destroyed the army. They deeply damaged the civil service, and they left the country a basket case. They set the stage in which then a power vacuum caused a civil war to break out, which killed thousands and displaced hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and plunged the country into a very dark period from which it now may be finally emerging.
You did something very unusual, Jürgen Todenhofer. You actually went and covered the war from the perspective of the Iraqi resistance. You went and saw exactly what they were doing. Were they fighting the Americans? Were they fighting Al-Qaeda? Who were they fighting against?
They were fighting for the freedom of their country. And they were fighting for the pride of their country. But Juan, I must say, I think there are still secrets in Iraq, because the Iraq image, the images that we see from Baghdad, are not the truth. I was in Iraq again in spring last year, in August last year, And this legendary city of 1001 nights has turned into a gloomy fortress of thousands of concrete walls, of thousands of shooting towers, of thousands of heavily armed checkpoints. And you can perhaps now, because you were a little bit optimistic, you can perhaps, I say perhaps, now vote freely, but you can't move freely anymore. And I had a camera team because I'm making a film about kids in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I asked my camera team, please film these concrete walls, film these towers, film these surveillance balloons over the city. And they said, we cannot. And I asked them 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then they said, yes, okay, we try. And in the evening, I got the information they were arrested, they were beaten up, the camera was confiscated, the material was confiscated, and the laptop was destroyed. And the reason why we don't see the real image is that this actual government doesn't want us to see the truth of this country. And for example, I was in the German embassy and I spoke to the ambassador and I wanted to discuss the situation in Baghdad. But these people are unable to tell you anything about Baghdad because the German diplomats in their embassy are not allowed to leave the embassy one single minute. The same holds true with the members, the diplomats of the American embassy. They never leave their compounds.
If that is the case, Jürgen Todenhofer, let me ask Juan Cole. Juan Cole on his website and as well as in some of his writing, he's saying that the Pentagon, and by that I guess that he means the military, it doesn't have to be the American Pentagon, they only want you to see what they want to see. They only take you to the cleansed area. They only want you to take to places where there is a story of success.
Right. Well, it's certainly the case that there's been enormous amounts of myth-making about Iraq and propaganda. I was more talking about, you know, what people who study Iraq can know. I mean, it's not a secret to any of us that Baghdad is an armed camp, that there are these barriers, that there are checkpoints. You know, I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in times of war in certain countries. So these things are not hidden from me, and they're in the Arabic press, which I translate and comment on. What I was really meaning was that you know, some people say, well, you know, we'll eventually find out why the Bush administration really did this, or what the deals were struck among the various Iraqi players and so forth. I don't think there are deep secrets here. I think it's pretty much as it seems on the surface, but that there is myth-making and propaganda about Iraq is certainly the case. The fact that the U.S. military destroyed the city of Fallujah, damaging 2/3 of its buildings, was deliberately covered up, and the New York Times helped with this in the aftermath. The White House here denied, at the height of a civil war that was killing 2,500 and 3,000 civilians a month, they denied that there was any civil war and reprimanded NBC News for using the term. So there has been a lot of propaganda and myth-making. But for people who actually concentrate on the subject, who follow the local press or do interviews with people out in the street, the situation is pretty transparent.
Yeah, Juan, for those who are informed, and I'm very happy that you are informed other people, but when I read the comments on the elections in the Western press, when I read that now a new chapter is opened, and when I see the reality in this country, the sadness, the US didn't liberate this country, they broke it. And as an example, in August last year, I went to Sadr city to a sheikh. He's a Shiite sheikh. He's the leader of one of the biggest tribes in Iraq. He's 29. He's now the leader of the tribe because 12 members of his family have been killed. And I said, now you are a Shia sheikh. Now, are you better off? You are liberated from Sadam Hussein. And he said, never in the history of our country there was such a mess than under the American occupation. And in the 6.5 years, it was last August, of the American occupation, more civilians have been killed than under the hard 35 years of Saddam. We have now less jobs, we have still now less electricity, we have less medical care, we have less clean water, we have less medical care, less security. Everything is getting worse. And now we say, oh, they have elections. I'm a former member of the German parliament. I was 18 years in the German parliament. I know that democracy is something important, but for the people in Iraq, what is important is security, is to have food.
That's a very good point, Jürgen Todenhofer. Let me give it to Juan. Juan, you know that very well, superpower are that just big elephant walking on grass. And the United States made a big blunder in Vietnam, and perhaps by now the Vietnam syndrome is behind you. Will Iraq become another syndrome, or will this destruction and death will be just a small footnote when the history of Iraq and the history of the region is written? How far with this Iraq and the US will be associated for a long time?
Oh, Iraq and the U.S. are deeply intertwined and will be for decades, probably. Certainly, there's always a debate in the United States when it launches one of these wars in the aftermath. Was it a good idea or not? At the moment, the vast majority of Americans have concluded that it wasn't a good idea, and very rapidly are losing interest in the whole subject. And you don't see so much Iraq reportage. If there weren't an election going on, you wouldn't even hear about it in the United States anymore. They don't, for the most part, the American public is aware that the U.S. made a mistake and broke that country, and they just don't want to hear about it because it's embarrassing. But I think that it is important not to have a monochrome view of Iraq's evolution. Things have changed over time, and at the moment we're at a situation where there aren't 3,000 civilians being killed every month. That was a horrible, kind of almost apocalyptic moment in 2006 and 2007. It's down to between 200 and 400. It is in the area that Mexico is in, which is not a really prospering state, but it's not any longer an apocalypse. The new Iraqi army is able to provide more security in places like Basra than it had before. We have to be careful when you talk about things like distribution of electricity and compare it to the old days, because Saddam Hussein denied electricity to cities like Hilla in the south and gave most of it to Baghdad. It was very important he make his capital happy. Now it's being distributed more evenly, which means that everybody has less of it in the center. But I think Iraq has enormous human potential. It is an oil state, it's got income, and its politicians are finding new compromises. In this election,
yes,
the Sunni Arabs did not vote for the most part, for a Sunni Arab party. They voted for an ex-Ba'ath Shiite, Ayad Alawi. This is not something that happened 3 years ago. So I don't want to buy into a kind of Hollywood optimism here, but I do think it is important to recognize that there are changes.
Jürgen Todenhofer, you were a leading member of the CDU. You are a judge. You have a PhD in law. Now you are subjected to personal hatreds and attacks. Are you an isolated voice? Are you an exception? What is it that is driving you towards Iraq?
I don't think that I'm isolated. What is driving me, you told your public that I was a judge, and that's my main reason. I'm driven by justice, and I think that the Western countries have been unfair with Iraq before the war, with the sanctions. The sanctions were a crime, and we have been completely unfair during this war. And what we have done in Iraq is so terrible. That's really the country with a world record of widows, of orphans, and of crippled children. And I have personally a little foundation. I pay money for young Iraqi kids who lose their legs and their arms. And I have seen so horrible things in this country. And that's just a kind of justice, that we have to do something for this country, and that we have to be a voice for this country. And I'm happy that I'm not alone. For example, Juan does the same. Perhaps sometimes we don't have the same point of view, but to show what is happening in this country. And the United States, the US Army, just cannot leave this country and say, now you have your own country and you have elections and we are going to live. There is a big, big problem that we have to find a way for reconciliation in this country. And now we have, Juan has mentioned that, we have excluded the elite of the army. Paul Bremer was the guy who did this very, very silly thing. We have excluded the elite of the administration. And we have to reconciliate this country, like we did it in South Africa or like we did it in Germany. This means also that in the future political process has to be included the resistance, the leaders of the resistance, the whole resistance, and this is not only a Sunni resistance, this is also a Shiite resistance. And I think we have also to include Ba'athists, those who didn't commit crimes. And I think this is very, very, very
Before
important.
Before that
because
process starts, you Todenhofer, let me ask Juan Cole, but then again, this has been the history of superpowers, Juan Cole. Superpowers always either invent incidents in order to go into war, or they just stumble into it. You are an American, you know exactly what I mean when I say the Gulf of Tonkin with Lyndon Johnson. You know exactly what I mean when it comes to the American-Mexican War, when an incident was contrived in order to have that war and take part of Mexico. You know exactly what I mean when we talk about the American-Indian War. Almost every single peace agreement with the army and the Indians was broken. What is it that drives superpowers to get into such acts?
Well, I think that there is a historical context here, which is that the fall of the Soviet Union left the United States as the sole superpower. And so the Bush administration could act virtually unilaterally. There were no checks in the world system on U.S. action, and for their own reasons, certainly it had a lot to do with all of that petroleum in Iraq. They invaded. But the important thing to note here is that they made a historical mistake, because in the past 60 years we have seen decolonization. We have seen the ways in which formerly colonized countries, including India and China, are themselves emerging as great powers. And I think Washington just did not understand that the Iraqis wouldn't put up with being occupied. They mounted both Shiite and Sunni military resistances, but they also mounted political resistance. Grand Ayatollah Sistani, the spiritual head of Iraqi Shiism, maneuvered the Bush administration into these open elections, gave fatwas or rulings that an Iraqi constitution and Iraqi government had to spring from the will of the Iraqi people. So the United States was not all powerful in Iraq. In fact, I would argue that at no point in the past 7 years was the U.S. really in control or able to dictate the course of events. The Iraqis have fought back, and in the course of doing so, as Jürgen rightly says, there were enormous internal fissures. There was mass killing. There are probably on the order of 4 million displaced Iraqis. The U.S. does have a responsibility to those displaced people to ensure that they are able to return to their homes, that they have restitution of property. And as long as you have 4 million displaced people in a country of some 31 million, the potential for future violence is great. So yes, the U.S. can't just withdraw without engaging in reconciliation moves.
Jürgen Todenhofer, in addition to your interest in Iraq, you have also a wider interest in the Muslim world. You have developed what you call the 10-point thesis. While we don't have time to outline all of them, what would be the most important of these 10-point theses?
The most important is that we, the Western people, have to recognize that the Western powers are much more violent than the Muslim, so-called little Muslim powers. We have done a lot of injustice to the Muslim countries. And what I tried to explain also is that Islam is a moderate religion, that love of one's neighbor plays a very, very great role in this great religion. I'm a Christian, I'm a member of the Christian Democratic Party, and that war is not a solution. The solution is negotiations, and I come back to reconciliation, because I want to come really to this point. There has to be also a reconciliation with the Ba'athists who didn't commit crimes. We had the same problem in Germany. We had the same problem with the Nazis. The German elite was in the Nazi party. And the main advisor of our greatest chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, was a Nazi. The German chancellor, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, he was a good friend of mine personally. He was a Nazi because he was a young diplomat at this time, and the only possibility to become and to be a diplomat was to enter the party. And he became a chancellor, and his vice-chancellor, Willy Brandt, he was in the resistance. And that's the process of reconciliation that has to happen in Iraq. But this process will not happen if you let only Alawi or Maliki to do the things. This is something that the US government has to do before leaving, to force the Iraqi government to start a real reconciliation process. Because that's the only chance to have a stable country in an unstable region.
Juan Col, a few names of the principal players of Iraq have been stated, mentioned. Bush, Paul Bremer, let's mention also Wolfowitz, Cheney, Tony Blair. When history is written, say, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, how will history judge this episode, judge these people, and judge the war on Iraq? The principals, especially Tony Blair and George Bush, they say, wait for history's judgment, then you will understand what we did was right.
Well, I think history, as a historian, I would say history will be very harsh towards that entire crew, largely because they gave false pretenses for their war. It becomes increasingly clear that Tony Blair hid things from his cabinet, that he manipulated, that he made fantastic pronouncements that simply weren't true, that he and Bush actively connived at a provocation that might make getting the war up easier. So, you know, dishonesty and hypocrisy is always a demerit in judging political action. And so there will always be those, because Iraq will heal. Iraq will eventually become a normal, wealthy country. There will always be those who say, well, okay, in the end it all worked out. But that's not that's a jejune argument. It is stupid and immature. That the Iraqis might eventually get their act together has nothing to say about the motives of the people who launched this war.
Juan Col, Jürgen Todenhofer, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you, Jassim, and thank you, Juan. You make a great job. Thank you.
It was great being here.
To watch the show online, please visit our website, aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until we meet again, this is Jassim Azawi wishing you a great week.